punch, it's the first of the month, it's 1st of November, hello everybody, and let's crack on with a couple more Spacesides, continuing with our alphabetical order, because I honestly couldn't think of any other order to do it. So the first one I'm going to do tonight is this, BenRiach. So this was a very kind donation from Mr. X. Thank you very much, Mr. X. One of the many that he very kindly sent through, or she, or they. Yeah. So this is a miniature. Just cracked it open, and this is the latest style. So I'm not worried that this is going to be like, not a fair representation. BenRiach was a distillery that's here, that was originally built in 1898, and it's slap bang next to the Longmorn distillery. It's basically almost in the grounds of the Longmorn distillery, and at one point it was known as Longmorn 2 rather than BenRiach. Now BenRiach is a Gaelic, has Gaelic pronunciation. Ben is Gaelic for mountain, or sort of large hill or something like that. Now Riach is a bit of an odd one. It seems to be in reference to a nearby farm that was called Rioch, R-I-O-C-H. But Riach doesn't really kind of mean anything directly. It's kind of got some kind of links to almost like grizzled type meaning, but like grizzled mountain, yeah, it's all a bit of an iffy one. But that's what it was. That's what it's been known now. So opened in 1898 by a guy called John Duff, who also owned the Longmorn distillery. Now, unfortunately, in 1900, or well, it kind of started off in 1898. Was the start of the Paterson whisky crisis, as it's known, which I went into in some detail, not a great deal of detail, but some detail when I did Altmore, which was a couple of whiskies ago. Essentially, if you've not watched Altmore, if you can't be bothered to go back and watch it, it was two brothers who got into whisky distribution, and it's like a rags to riches to rags story in terms of they managed to get some really good products. They were distributing, they managed to get hold of loads of whiskey distillers, they were buying stock off them, they were selling loads of whiskey, everything was hunky-dory. They were taking advantage of the fact that cognac was on a downturn because they were having issues with phylloxera in the vineyards, and everything was coming up roses. But they started to push their luck. They were living the high life, living the life of Riley, but everything was based on credit. And when the creditors started to come back to get their money, nothing was there because they were frittering the profits away on equivalents of holidays to the Algarve, that sort of thing. So it did hit the whisky industry quite hard. It was kind of combined with cognac coming back into strength. Also kind of early parts of Prohibition in America and a general worldwide depression, and sort of the turn of the 1900s really was very, very difficult for Scotch whisky. And so BenRiach opens in 1898, shuts in 1900. John Duff himself ended up having to sell the distillery and Longmorn to a company called the Longmorn Distillery Company because he couldn't operate it. They bought it, shut down BenRiach, and that was it for 65 years. Until it was bought by the Glenlivet Distillers Limited, who did a kind of patch-up job on the distillery and started operation again. It got sold to Seagram's in 1977. Who through various kind of parts, Seagram's went out, Pernod Ricard bought parts of Seagram's, and it became part of them. When they took over in 2000, 2001, when the whole thing went through, BenRiach then shut again in 2002. So it wasn't shut for that long this time. It was actually bought by a guy called Billy Walker, and Billy Walker is here. Billy Walker with two, I think they were South African kind of financiers. Now Billy Walker used to be operations manager of a company called Burn Stewart, who Scottish Leader is probably their biggest blended whiskey, but sort of very highly regarded whiskey distributor rather than a producer, but bottler, blender, distributor. And Billy Walker bought the BenRiach distillery from Pernod Ricard, mothballed at the time, so it wasn't doing anything, for a grand total of 5 million quid. Got it up and running and was doing a fantastic job. Relabeled it, actually, and you might notice that the R in Riach is capitalised, and that was actually their, almost like their kind of, this is our whiskey, rather than the old BenRiach. Older BenRiach, pre-Billy Walker taking over, the R, if you're writing it down, is like lowercase r. It's all one word, BenRiach, whereas this is kind of like two separate words. And was doing really, really highly regarded whiskies. They were doing non-peated and peated versions. There was a sort of no age statement. Now this is the 12-year-old that I've got for Mr. X, but they have a no age statement called Heart of Speyside. They also did peated versions, pretty heavily peated versions as well, sort of harking back to sort of saying almost Speyside whiskies used to be quite heavily peated, or not all of them, but some used to be quite heavily peated because that was what they used, and that was how they could dry the barley. So they were doing it, and it was a pretty heavily peated. We're not talking full-on Lefroy Ardbeg, but there was definitely some kick to it. Again, no age statement called the Curiositas, and then age statements as well. And also various wood finishes, and really not quite flooding the market. And I can remember it was the relatively early days of BenRiach when I was working at the whiskey shop, so they were really pushing it, and we did have an awful lot of them, and it nearly got to the point where it was like, come on guys, just rein it in a little bit. You're actually you've got too many out there. But again, very highly regarded. They ended up buying GlenDronach, who was struggling at the time, and they also bought Glenglassaugh. Now GlenDronach and Glenglassaugh, or Glenglassaugh, have been covered previously in the challenge. GlenDronach, fantastic whiskey, absolutely brilliant, really heavily sherried, classic Christmas whiskey. Glenglassaugh, the revival, the no age statement version I had, not a fan, not a great whiskey at all. But apparently the other releases that they do are very, very good indeed. April of this year, all of a sudden, out the blue, Brown-Forman, who are the owners of Jack Daniels, amongst other relatively well-known whiskey and drinks names, purchase the BenRiach distillery company, I think it's called, which is basically, they bought from Billy Walker, BenRiach, GlenDronach, Glenglassaugh. So he paid 5 million quid for it back in 2004, and in 2016 sold it for 285 million quid. So not a bad return on his investment. From what I did read a little bit earlier, was apparently Billy Walker and his family were looking at getting 95 million quid. What a bastard. Anyway, so when it was announced earlier this year, there really was a kind of like, in the whiskey community online, there was quite a few people going, ooh, is this a good thing? Is this actually going to, are they going to let it operate as it was, or are we going to see new versions of BenRiach and Glenglassaugh and GlenDronach, or are they going to disappear? What's going to go on? Nobody really knows. It's still early days. Everybody's a little bit on tenterhooks, to be perfectly honest. Sort of those that are heavily involved in it, because as with anything, when a company takes over, nobody really knows what's going to happen. And when it's like a big behemoth like Brown-Forman, it really is a case of, well, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to leave it, or are they going to start arsing about with it and making it not what it was previously, which is why it was so popular and worth that amount of money in the first place? So that's the miniature. This is what the full-size bottle looks like. You're looking at about 43 quid. It's released at 43%, not 40. The no age statement, which is known as Heart of Speyside for the unpeated version, and Curiositas is the peated version, which is essentially that with a black label. They're peated versions. It's about 35 quid. Now, I can remember having the Heart of Speyside when I was at a whiskey shop, and it was pretty fiery, so I'll be quite interested to see what this is like, because I've got a feeling giving it an age statement might round off that. It was almost like it was a little bit too young, so it'd be interesting to see what this is like. Now, there is a good malty character to it, but there is some fruit on there as well. And it's like clementines. It's not orange, It's a much sweeter oranginess. It's like clementines and satsumas. There is a maltiness to it as well, but it's almost like pastry. It's a little bit like if you had a tart that was made of clementines and almost in like a clementine jelly as well. It's light, but there is a depth to it in the background, but there's a really nice gentle sweetness to it. That's quite a pleasant nose. Not massively deep, but what's there is very, very pleasant indeed. And it actually carries on the palate, that sweet oranginess. So it's definite, Satsumas, clementines. We're not talking like full-size oranges. We're talking sweet baby orange fruit. Again, the maltiness is there. It's not heavily toffee. This is a little bit lighter. That's really drinkable. Really, really is kind of light, slightly delicate, juicy. It's almost mouth-watering as well. That's very, very pleasant indeed. It's not massively rich and massively deep and massively complex, but as an entry level, as an advert for what the rest of BenRiach could possibly offer, that's really very good indeed. And that 43% gives it a little bit of sparkle, just lifts everything. So it's almost like, in fact, it's almost like Bucks Fizz, where when you put your champagne with the orange juice, it knocks down the sharpness of the orange juice and sweetens it, but then you get the fizz and the sparkle and that slightly dryness of the sparkling wine. And it's not too dissimilar to that, obviously with a bit more of a kick. The maltiness is there, but it's at the background. This really is kind of sparkle and juiciness. And then there's a malty, kind of sweet malt, slight fudginess, but it's not particularly rich. It's pastry as well. It really is like a butter pastry case, that sort of sensation. But it's underlying. It's really kind of subdued, and it's there on the finish rather than like around your tongue and around your mouth. It's on the finish. It's down as you swallow. It's very, very pleasant indeed. Colour me impressed. That is a very good Speyside whisky, and that's a very good representation of a Speyside whisky as well. It's very drinkable. There is nothing really in that is going to put anybody off. There's no smokiness to it. It's not massively heavily sherried. It's not. There's just nothing that would kind of put anybody off. It's got enough weight to it that it's not going to be too light. It's got a nice mouthfeel, but it's not too rich, it's not too sickly, it's not too fruity. It's got everything that you would want from a whiskey that would appeal to a lot of whiskey drinkers. So I can kind of see why this was doing really, really well. I'm really picking up Satsumas and clementines on that. I really am. That's the overriding flavour for me, which I think is really nice and really interesting. Good whiskey, good, solid, dependable, all-round whiskey. Not mind-blowing, but just really well made and does exactly what it needs to be doing. So good stuff. So hopefully Brown-Forman aren't going to dick about with this too much and they're going to leave that as is, because if they start mucking that up, they could find themselves in a spot of bother. Right, quick rinse out and then on to something relatively special. So I'll see you at the next one. Cheers.